But let me tell you more about Denis. Denis spent much of his early career abroad in Turkey and Lebanon, and I was just contemplating that as I was cycling here this morning, that he tells me he was evacuated 3 times from Beirut in the 80s, finally left in 1986, and it must be a particular sadness, I think, to you, mustn't it, now, to see what the violence that's happening in Beirut at the moment, the families that are being destroyed by that violence. But Denis also told me that he wrote his first book on science and faith huddled in the corridor of his apartment in Beirut. Huddled in the corridor because you have to be away from the windows. If you ever have the good fortune to go to his house, you'll find a little tray on the mantelpiece full of bits of shrapnel which came through the window. So Denis, after spending that time in Turkey and Lebanon largely, came back to Britain, and he's been working on cancer at the Babraham Institute most recently, where he leads a research group and is still active in that. But today he's going to talk to us, as you see, about the historical background to the science-religion debate. So we're looking forward very much to that, and I'll give the floor to you, Denis.
Now, you've already been exposed during the course of this week so far to various kinds of models relating science and faith. And of course, there are hundreds of them. And for our purposes this morning, I just want to focus on 4. We've already really had them introduced to us, but just to do a little bit of review here. And then we're going to look at those models in the context of the history of science and religion. Now, the first one is the very obvious one of the conflict model or the conflict thesis, the one that's probably continues to receive most attention in contemporary public debate on the relationship between science and faith. We've already had a number of these iconic names mentioned to us during the course of this week, people like Richard Dawkins and Peter Atkins, both, I have to say, from the other place, as we say here in Cambridge, from Oxford. You know, we don't have those kind of people here, but they're the sort of representatives of this strongly sort of atheistic and conflict thesis idea of the relationship between science and faith. In the United States, you have people like Dan Dennett and so forth, already been mentioned. And of course, the idea here is that not only today, but historically also, science and faith have been locked in a kind of combat over the centuries, and they provide conflicting explanations for the way that the world is. As the tide of scientific knowledge swept in, so the tide of religious knowledge was forced to retreat until finally science reigned supreme. That's the modernist, triumphalist account of the relationship between science and faith. And so one of the questions that we're going to be addressing today is, how did that get started? Where did that idea come from? Now, the second model is one that's also been mentioned to us already. It's sometimes called the NOMA model because Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a book a few years ago, introduced this terminology, and that stands for the non-overlapping magisteria. It's simply a rather complicated way of saying that science and religion live in separate compartments. They don't really interact with each other. They have separate questions. They live in different worlds. And that, of course, is reflected in the structure of our modern-day universities, where you have different departments. The people in divinity don't normally visit the people down the road in molecular biology. You have separate domains, and they're doing separate kinds of things. So there's no reason why they should come into conflict, because they live in these separate worlds. You've got another model, which is a very broad one. Perhaps we haven't mentioned that so much. I call it the fusion model, although it can be called different names. And this is a broad category, as I say, which includes many sort of submodels, if you like. But the idea is that science and religion are in some way fused together. They are identified with each other. So either you get attempts to build religious systems belief out of scientific knowledge, or you get the reverse, where scientific knowledge is based on religious belief. And just to give you one example of what I mean, if some of you here might be familiar with the books of writers like Fritjof Capra, such as The Tao of Physics, and you'll therefore be familiar with the idea that in this case Capra tried to take quantum mechanics and show how this was supported by the writers of the ancient Chinese Taoist philosophers and vice versa. There's a kind of resonance between modern quantum mechanics and that particular stream of philosophy. That's a typical example of a kind of fusion model. We've also mentioned a very different kind of example several times during the course of the week, which is the scientific creationist model. And in that case, you're trying to take a religious text and trying to use it to build scientific ideas. That's another example of this kind of fusion kind of idea. And then the fourth one we had introduced to us very nicely, in fact, by George Ellis on the first day, also by Peter Clark and others yesterday, which we can call, if you like, the complementarity model. This is the idea that science and religion are about the same reality. They're trying to look at the same kind of thing, but they're looking at it from very different kinds of angles, perspectives, if you like, which are not rivals to each other, but which are complementary. So just as you can read a novel at many different levels, so the properties of the universe itself can be read at different levels. One level, for example, being that of mechanism. We were thinking about the brain yesterday as a machine, whereas the other level is at the level of meaning, the theological level, the philosophical level. Okay, so that's those four outlines. And if Becky's around, I wouldn't mind a glass of water, but she's not, so I don't know if somebody can just get me a glass to get rid of my frog in my throat. Now, I said that scientists like to give the take-home message as soon as they can. So I'm going to give you the conclusions of, it's always a dangerous thing to give your conclusions at the beginning of your talk, otherwise people might just go to sleep. But essentially what I want to say is this. First of all, there is no single overriding model that does justice to the interactions between science and religion over the centuries. It simply is far too complex for that. So please don't think in anything that I say today that I want to give one model. Thank you very much, Paul. The whole thing is very, very complex indeed, and indeed John Hedley Brooke has underlined this, and he doesn't like, I don't think really, the idea of any models at all, but rather you simply talk about complexity and you try and describe that complexity. But when you're a scientist, you know, you've only got 1 hour, you've got to have models, and so we're going to have models this morning. And the second thing I'm going to say is that the conflict model, as a dominant description of the relationship between science and religion over the centuries, is actually quite wrong. It's fallacious. It just won't work. The third thing I'm going to say is the emergence of modern science has been characterized by a continual traffic of ideas between science and religion in both directions. It's actually a traffic, an exchange that continues right up to the present day. And then I'm also going to say that there are good reasons to believe that the Christian worldview played a positive and very important role, in fact, in the emergence of modern science. Now, of course, having lived, as Bob mentioned, in the Middle East for 15 years, I'm very aware of the enormous contributions made by Islamic thinkers and philosophers, especially in the early medieval period, to the emergence of modern science. I actually don't have time. I simply don't have time to include everything that we'd like to include. It's simply impossible. However, we will be returning on Monday to this whole question of the early medieval period, I think, when David Lindbergh speaks to us, as he is very much an expert in that particular area. Now, I just want to underline the fact that the kind of conclusions that I've just shown to you are actually very different from those that were popular during the time when I was a student in Oxford reading biochemistry in the mid-1960s. And I was very much brought up at that time surrounded by this triumphalist, modernist account of the history of science, whereby free-thinking rationalists had steadily conquered over the forces of religious prejudice and clerical oppression. Now, scientists have often been guilty, I think, of propagating what has been called a Whiggish view of the history of science, and I need to explain that to you. The epithet Whiggish originates from a classic book written by Herbert Butterfield, who taught history here in this university for about 50 years. In 1931, he wrote a book called The Whig Interpretation of History, and in that book, Butterfield criticized those English historians who were very much allied with the Whig political party, as they were then called, and they'd sort of rewritten history as a triumphalist story of how their nation had gradually approached their own political ideals. And you get this very much in the earlier historical writings, this Whiggish view, just tracking the landmarks, the lead up to the present day where we now are. And scientists have often been guilty of doing that. And at the time when I was starting out my scientific research career in the 1970s, Carl Sagan's popular TV series called Cosmos was viewed at that time by an estimated 140 million people. That's 3% of the human population at that time. And it remains a classic example of a Whiggish rewriting of the history of science. And so what in Cosmos Sagan did was to select various aspects of the roots of science which appeared to him to be modern, and then he charted the stepping stones of modernity through the centuries until finally he arrived at truly modern science, which of course is where we are today. And in the process he tried to show how science had conquered over the forces of religious oppression. But as David Lindbergh has said, and this is the same person who's coming to speak in this course on Monday, the historian's task is not to grade the past, but to understand it. I think that's a very critical statement, not to grade the past, but to understand it. And of course, that's really our goal for our discussion today. And I think we can be very thankful to the many revisionist historians, of whom Peter Harrison is one, and there are many others who over the past few decades have been picking apart this rather triumphalist modernist tale that was so popular when I was a student, and they've revealed this series really of science-religion interactions that are much more complex, much more interesting than those given in these early Whiggish accounts. And that's why you can have, for example, historians of science like Stephen Shapin, who recently remarked in his book The Scientific Revolution, in the late Victorian period it was common to write about the warfare between science and religion and to presume that these two bodies of culture must always have been in conflict. However, it has been a very long time since these attitudes have been held by historians of science. You simply won't find historians of science supporting these very naive views about the interactions, thankfully. And I think also those same revisionist historians, if we can call them that, have done us a great service in highlighting some of the incredible mutants that have become embedded in the scientific literature. And I call them, as a geneticist, I call them mutants. You know, they have a history. And by mutants, I mean those errors of fact, like genetic mutations that have a particular history, but which unfortunately spread with remarkable ease through the historical literature, sometimes being promoted because they suit the polemical goals of the writer. Now, there's one classical example of this, what I want to give to you this morning. It's still widely held that people in medieval times generally thought that the world was flat. Have we not all read, perhaps in our youth, of Columbus's sailors fearing that they might fall off the edge of the world as they set off on their great voyages of discovery? In Joseph Chiari's play, which I noticed was recently produced in London, revived last year, about Christopher Columbus, we have the following dialogue which is put into the mouths of Columbus and a prior. A prior is a priest, kind of priest in the church. Columbus, the earth is not flat, father, it's round. The prior, don't say that. Columbus, it's the truth. It's not a mill pond strewn with islands, it's a sphere. The prior, don't say that, it's blasphemy. Right, so you get the idea. So I can still remember actually the personal sense of shock that I experienced that when I found out that actually this idea is completely fallacious. I was brought up with the idea that medieval people thought the world was flat. Actually, as it happens, as I'm sure many know here, all people in medieval times knew that the world is round, not least the sailors who were sailing with Columbus. With extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC, not AD, BC onwards, believed that the earth was flat. Everyone in medieval Christendom knew that the world was round. Nobody, in fact, before the 1830s believed that medieval people thought that the world was flat. So, how did the idea ever get going in the first place? Well, actually, it was established almost at the same time, this mutation in the history of science and religion, by a Frenchman and an American, apparently quite independently. There's no evidence they ever met. The Frenchman was Antoine Jean Letron. He was living there in the early part of the 19th century when he wrote his book. He was an academic with strong anti-religious beliefs who wrote a book called On the Cosmographical Ideas of the Church Fathers, in which he misrepresented the early church fathers who lived in the centuries after Christ to give the impression that they believed that that medieval people thought that the earth was a flat earth. And the American was Washington Irving. Again, 19th century, he wrote historical novels, and his book about Christopher Columbus, which he wrote in 1828, invented this heroic picture of Columbus, who was the simple mariner, simple seafaring person, and sorry, I have to give his quote in old-fashioned 19th century English, appearing before a dark crowd of benighted inquisitors and hooded theologians at a council of Salamanca in Spain, all of whom believed, according to Irving, that the earth was flat like a plate. Now, unfortunately, this completely fictitious account was soon absorbed as fact, and I actually wonder whether some of the mythologies and the Da Vinci Code might quickly go the same route. You know, people write a novel, and then suddenly people actually think it's not a novel, it's actually something true. Now, further details of this can be found in this very entertaining account of how the flat mythology started in this book by Geoffrey Burton Russell entitled Inventing the Flat Earth. And I think we tried to get it for our bookstall. I have a horrible feeling it's out of print, but I think you can still certainly find it in libraries. And I think what's so fascinating about this rather sorry tale is the way in which this mythology was taken up by the people who wanted to promote the conflict model in the 19th century to support their idea that medieval people were both religious and stupid. And this was in contrast to this triumphalist account of science, which was going to sort of blow away the cobwebs of religious superstition. But like the Dark Ages, the flat earth was a 19th century invention. You don't get talk in the literature, by the way, of the Dark Ages, until you get to the 19th century. This is a typical optimistic, progressive, modernistic account of earlier centuries. Now, I mention this historical mutation because there are a lot of them out there in the literature of science-religion interactions, especially in the older literature, so it's good to be careful. It's good to be careful when you're reading some of these earlier books. And unfortunately, several of them contributed in the past to the construction of the conflict model. But by the same token, as their mutant status has been uncovered, so I think that's hastened the death of that particular model, at least in academic circles. Now, if we're to look sensibly at the relationship between these two entities of science and religion, then I think obviously we need to come up with some definitions as to what those terms actually mean. Now, as far as contemporary science is concerned, we might want to try the following kind of definition. Science is an organized endeavor to explain the properties of the physical world by means of empirically testable theories constructed by a research community trained in specialized techniques. Now, I don't think that definition is perfect. We could obviously discuss it for a long time, but I think that encompasses most of the aspects of contemporary science. But as we go back in history, life gets much more complicated. The term science, of course, in the Middle Ages was used to refer to virtually any body of accurate constructed knowledge. At that time, in Europe, theology was famously known then as the queen of the sciences because it was deemed to encompass all other forms of knowledge. And in past centuries, what we now know as science was much more commonly called natural philosophy, and those who pursued it were known as natural philosophers. The word scientist in the English language is of relatively recent invention. It was invented in 1834 by a cleric here in Cambridge called William Whewell, who was master of Trinity College, and he was one of the great polymaths, as we call them, of 19th century Cambridge, someone who knew a lot about everything. Quite terrifying people to have around. And by the way, he also invented the word physicist, he invented the word cathode, he invented the word anode. He just liked inventing words, and of course we use a lot of them today. Now, Darwin, for example, never did like the word scientist. He didn't like being called a scientist. He much preferred to be called a natural philosopher to the end of his days. Now, remember, this is an English sort of language game we're playing here, and it's different in different languages, and I don't have time to get into that, but in many of the languages represented here, the term used for science would very often have more of that sense of a constructed body of knowledge and wouldn't be just restricted to contemporary modern science, as we call it. So it gets quite complicated. But when I use the word science, as of now, I'm going to be using that kind of definition, but I'll try and remember to call natural philosophers when we're talking about earlier centuries. Now, as far as the term religion is concerned, our discussion, as I mentioned, will largely revolve around Christianity as an institutionalized religious faith for the simple reason that it was Christianity in its various manifestations that dominated the European scene during the emergence of modern science. By general consent, the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe were critical for the emergence of modern science. And the term scientific revolution has often been used to describe what happened during the course of those 2 centuries, although I know that many historians of science don't like that term, preferring rather to emphasize the gradual development of thought that was already taking place in the preceding centuries. But be that as it may, everyone has agreed that some huge changes in thinking about the physical world occurred during that period that laid the groundwork for what we now call modern science. So, what actually happened? First of all, we need to make an important sociological point, a point which was quantified, I think, in rather striking fashion by an American sociologist called Rodney Stark. Now, Stark decided to make a list of the major natural philosophers during the period 1543 to 1680, the critical period during which the first scientific journals were being established, the first scientific societies were being established, and so forth. And Stark accepted into his list of 52 names only those who were themselves active natural philosophers who had made really significant contributions to the progress of natural philosophy at that time. And you can see there the breakdown of where these people were from, which countries they came from, and so forth. Now, next, Stark looked at their denomination and happily found that 26 were Catholic and 26 were Protestant, very convenient 50% ratio. And he also found that 15 out of 52, in fact, had ecclesiastical careers at the same time as ministers or monks or priests of some kind. So remember that scientist as a separate profession is something very recent. You simply don't find that in earlier years. We'll come back to that issue later on. But perhaps most interesting of all was Stark's analysis of their religious commitment. And so what Stark did was to divide these 52 kind of star performers, if you like, into 3 broad categories: the devout, the conventionally religious, and the skeptics. Now, to code someone as devout, Stark searched for clear signs of especially deep religious concerns. The label of conventionally religious was applied to those whose biography offers no evidence of skepticism, but they weren't particularly pious as far as we can make out from what they wrote or what other people said about them. And then the term skeptic was reserved by Stark for anyone who displayed doubt that the world was the work of a conscious, responsive God. Now you can see there the results. They're quite striking. More than 60% of the sample of these sort of star natural philosophers over the period are classified as devout, whereas only 2 out of 52, that's 3.8%, could be classified as skeptic. And if you want to know who those 2 were, they were Edmund Halley and Paracelsus. Now, in fact, Paracelsus had many religious beliefs connected with astrology and magic. I think we would now want to call him a New Ager if he probably lived now, whereas it does seem that Halley was an atheist. And I think the high proportion in that devout category is especially striking because although state-validated religion clearly played a very important role during this era, don't get the idea that the level of personal religious commitment or piety was particularly high in Europe during that time. It's simply not the case. It depends where you were, it depends on your class, and it depends what country you were and so forth. And if you look at the life of Robert Boyle's family, for example, it was certainly not a very pious family. I can assure you, I can tell some stories about that. Now, I think there's some very good reasons for thinking that, as I say, the Christian commitment and worldview of these early scientific pioneers did actually contribute very significantly to the emergence of modern science. But to see how that happened, we need to step back to the late 10th century when a Benedictine monk called Constantine made his way to the monastery of Monte Cassino in southern Italy. And there he began to translate medical works from Arabic to Latin, the language at the time of European academia, and these included the works of Galen, the works of Hippocrates, so supplying the foundations of the medical literature on which the West would build then for several centuries. And this, again, is a good place to underline the point that I'm well aware of the huge and valuable medieval literature by Islamic writers such as Al-Ghazali, such as Ibn Rushd, or as he was known as Averroes in the Latin West, as Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he was known in the Latin West. But we simply don't have time, unfortunately, to survey all that earlier literature, which is quite fascinating. And as I say, hopefully you'll be hearing more about that early next week, those who are still here. Now, once these early translations took place into Latin, academics in Europe really got excited. They wanted some more. And beginning in the first half of the 12th century, translation of the ancient classical works into Latin, first of all from Arabic, later on from the original Greek, became a major scholarly activity, with Spain as the main geographical focus. And by the 13th century, a flood of works by Aristotle were translated. And the European sort of academic world reeled before this great influx of new knowledge coming from the ancient Greek philosophers. And in fact, it's been claimed, and I can believe it, that a 14th century natural philosopher had a better library of Greek classics at his fingertips than did Augustine writing back in the early 5th century. Now, our minds are so used to viewing what is modern as being intrinsically better in contrast to things which are old and irrelevant, that I think it's quite difficult for us to think our way back into the kind of mindset of these medieval scholars. For us, the translation of an ancient text would be of great potential historical significance, but we would be unlikely to look to it as a source of scientific information. But for the medieval world, it was quite the reverse. The ancient philosophers, especially Greek philosophers, were looked to as the supreme authorities in matters of philosophy, and science therefore became the analysis and the illustration of what the great philosophers taught. Nevertheless, it shouldn't be thought that these waves of Greek philosophy which flooded into medieval Europe were merely passively accepted. Quite the reverse. New translations became the objects of passionate debate, and occasionally the Church made strenuous attempts to suppress the newly translated philosophy insofar as it was against the central tenets of Christian doctrine. But what was much more common was this attempt to fuse the ancient learning with Christian theology. And the person who perhaps did that more than any other to combine the philosophy of the ancients with Christian teaching was the Italian Dominican friar, very well-known name as St. Thomas Aquinas, who in the 13th century made this kind of fusion of Aristotle into medieval theology, which formed a system which later came to be known as scholasticism by later philosophers. So in the process, Aquinas sort of Christianized Aristotle to a very large degree. For example, Aristotle believed that matter was eternal, and so he had no belief in a God resembling the personal creator God of Christian or indeed Islamic theology, but Aquinas firmly maintained these key Christian doctrines. On the other hand, through Aquinas and others, Aristotle's cosmology was accepted into medieval Christendom virtually as an article of faith, as it became, and that later on had disastrous consequences for Galileo, as we'll just touch on very briefly in a moment. Now, in Aristotle's cosmology, as I'm sure you'll be familiar, you have the stationary Earth, which is at the center here, and then above it you've got a heavenly order consisting of all these sort of concentric circles of different things. You start with water, then you go to air, then you get to fire, and then you get further out the heavenly bodies, which are arranged in this sort of concentric spheres which are invisible, and then the boundary of the universe is formed by the outermost sphere, whose divine harmony caused the circular revolution of this whole celestial system. And then beyond the edge of the universe, you have Aristotle's God with a small g, who's a sort of unmoved mover, as he's called. And I always think of him like a sort of giant who's kind of flicking an onion, to keep the whole thing occasionally kind of circulating, this complex series of spheres moving round this immovable earth. So that was the sort of Aristotelian cosmology that was delivered to these medieval natural philosophers. Now this torrent of ancient classical learning that hit Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries had an enormous impact. And in fact, the universities which were founded at that time, Oxford first, Cambridge a little bit later, and others in Paris, and of course some very ancient universities in Italy and so on, and also Belgium and Holland, all of those universities that were founded about that time from the 12th century onwards, their aim was to convey this wealth of classical learning to their students. That was why they were founded, to do this. That was their job, to discuss it and write it and think about it and so forth. And I would suggest that from the point of view of the development of modern science, the rediscovery of the ancient philosophers made a whole range of very, very important contributions, and we just got time to focus on two this morning. First of all, one of the great contributions was this ability to think in a logical and orderly manner. Here you had a whole body of constructed knowledge which was very impressive. It gave insights into the world and its nature and its being and so forth. And it presented to the European mind an impressive example of what a body of constructed knowledge should look like and how to think rationally, actually how to think in a logical way. And second came, of course, this passion for mathematics that is most prominent in Pythagoras and Plato, which had a huge impact on the emergence of modern science. Now, for the Lutheran astronomer Johannes Kepler, one of the key founders of modern astronomy, astronomers, he says, are the priests of God, called to interpret the book of nature, and the key to that interpretation is mathematics. Why waste words, says Kepler? Geometry existed before the creation. It's co-eternal with the mind of God. Geometry provided God with a model for the creation. Isn't that a wonderful quotation about the power of mathematics in the emergence of astronomy in this case? Now, Kepler was one of those many early natural philosophers who had a very strong biblical faith. He was actually trained to be a Lutheran minister, and he drew at the same time enormous inspiration from the mathematical vision of these Greek thinkers such as Pythagoras. So a very interesting example of this fusion between biblical thought and also Greek classical thought at the same time. And so it was, to a large degree, as Europeans reacted to this great mass of ancient classical learning, that they eventually worked out a very different way of viewing the world. Now, apart from their common Christian commitment, perhaps what unites these Stark's 50 out of 52 star natural philosophers of the scientific revolution more than anything else is their own sense that they were engaging in something quite new. Their new natural philosophy was distinct from that inherited from the ancients such as Aristotle. Now, how do we explain that? There is no doubt, I think, that their Christian theological convictions did play a significant role, as I say, and actually many of them, thankfully, took a lot of trouble to tell us about that in their own writings. This is not just the interpretation of later historians, but we're just reading their text and seeing what they actually tell us. So I just want to spend a few minutes now on thinking about what were the ways in which historians have suggested that a Christian worldview made an impact on the emergence of modern science. Now, obviously, as we do this, let's not forget there were lots of factors involved. There were economic factors, there were political factors, there were social factors. To be a natural philosopher, you needed patronage. Economic factors were extremely important. So what we're doing now is just focusing down on one narrow little segment of the cake, if you like, of these critical issues, critical factors that you need to see a new way of thinking emerge. So let's not forget that as we do our little focus here. Now, first of all, central to Christianity, as indeed, of course, in Islam, The Abrahamic faith is this concept of a creator God who is brought into being a rational universe which can be described by physical laws. There was nothing like this all-powerful creator God in classical Greek thinking. It simply didn't exist. Now, if you look at Plato, for example, in his Timaeus, you have the idea of what he called a demiurge, struggling to shape the material of the world. The world was already created, but the demiurge was struggling to create the world according to eternal forms or ideas, but actually not being very successful. So you have the idea of matter fighting back, and you've got a kind of struggle going on there between the demiurge and matter. In Aristotle, all forms of matter were characterized by their own particular and necessary characteristic, or physis, as it's called, from which, of course, we get the word physics. So the physis of a stone is to fall downwards. The physis of fire is to go upwards. Every property of matter is characterized by its own internal necessity. But Aristotle's unmoved mover that we met a moment ago is nothing like the creator God of Christianity, because don't forget that in the Aristotelian view, matter is eternal, it's not created. There's no need for any creator anyway. In contrast, the God of the Bible can do what he likes, and it's up to natural philosophers to determine this empirically. It cannot be worked out from first principles as the Greek rationalists thought, and many of those natural philosophers were very conscious of that kind of point. And indeed, it was made very strongly by Coates in his preface to the second edition of Isaac Newton's great work, the Principia Mathematica. And these were words clearly approved by Isaac Newton himself, here, just down the road. And Coates writes this, a number of things, but just to pick out the words there: without all doubt, this world could arise from nothing but the perfectly free will of God. These laws of nature, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, that is just guessing, but we've got to learn them from observations and experiments. Now, as you probably know, Newton himself was a very devout believer who wrote far more on biblical themes, in fact, than he ever did on physics. In fact, he wrote more than 1 million words on his theological and biblical interests. He wrote another 1 million words, by the way, on alchemy, although his theological writings remain largely unpublished during his own lifetime, and only now, actually, is the full collection of Newton's writings becoming available, and a great project to put them all up on the web. So soon we'll be able to read all of this very speculative stuff he wrote about some of the prophecies of Daniel and all kinds of things. He wrote far more about that than he ever did about gravity. But Newton is typical of those natural philosophers in his passionate conviction that the search for order in the universe, order describable by laws, is only made possible by the actions of a rational creator God. Now, the second great theme that we find as we read through the writings of the early natural philosophers is that of science as part of their worship. Now, for today's secularized scientist who's used to reading dry scientific papers, this comes as a bit of a shock. But here is a quote, again, this is from Kepler. This is from Kepler writing to Galileo, written just after reading Galileo's book, The Sidereal Message, book written by Galileo, reporting on the startling new discoveries which he'd made with his telescope. Again, slightly old English, sorry about that, can't change it. But this is what Kepler said: I yearn to discuss with you, I long to discuss with you, most accomplished Galileo, the many undisclosed treasures of Jehovah, the Creator. Jehovah is just another word for God, which he reveals to us one after another. For who is permitted to remain silent at the news of such developments? Who is not filled with a surging love of God, pouring itself copiously through tongue and pen? Amazing. As Kepler writes in another context, I had the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is by my endeavours also glorified in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God. Now, the idea of the two books, and I'm glad that I think it was Christine who mentioned that last night in our discussion time right at the end there, but the idea of the two books is found frequently in the writings of the natural philosophers of this period. referring to the scriptures as the book of God's word, whereas nature represents the book of God's works. Robert Boyle, for example, said that as the two great books of nature and scripture have the same author, so the study of the latter does not at all hinder an inquisitive man's delight in the study of the former. So here's a good example of, if you like, the complementarity model beginning to emerge. You need both books, one in each hand, and they're complementary. Of course, Boyle didn't use that language, but that sort of idea is perhaps coming through here. A third theme that we find repeatedly in the writings of the natural philosophers is the idea that the contingency of God's actions encourages an empirical attitude towards the natural world. We've already seen that in Coates' preface to Newton's Principia. In reaction against the classical Greek philosophers with the idea that everything is created or acts by necessity, and that therefore their properties can be worked out rationally from first principles, the Christian natural philosophers said, no, they can't. God can do what he likes. And sometimes what he chooses to do can be completely opposite to common sense. And the only way that we can find out what God has actually done is by accurate observation and by experiment, by actually doing experiments to find out. Here we have, for example, John Wilkins. He was an Anglican bishop. He had Puritan sympathies. He was one of the key founding members of the Royal Society. He was actually the first secretary of the Royal Society. And he frequently started his written discussions in science and mechanics with an examination of what Aristotle thought about the subject. But then he went on to say, well, Aristotle was wrong, and now we're going to believe this. We should not be so superstitiously devoted to antiquity, writes Wilkins, in this very, again, difficult language, I'm sorry about that, of a 17th century bishop, as for to take up everything as canonical which drops from the pen of a father. Now what he's saying there, we shouldn't just accept, what these ancient philosophers say. We've got to do things for ourselves. We've got to think for ourselves. We must labour to find out what things are in themselves by our own experience, not what another says of them. Now that's actually quite novel. It's so common to us, we take it for granted. But remember that in that period, this is something really quite new. This is a new natural philosophy that these people are propounding. By the way, Wilkins was the only person in history, I think, to be master of both an Oxford College and a Cambridge College. So, he was, again, quite a polymath. He did a lot of things in his life. Now, the fourth theme in the scientific revolution that has these very strong theological overtones is the enthusiasm of many of these early natural philosophers for what came to be known as the new mechanical philosophy. And that was a term which was pretty much the same, used in the same way as the new experimental philosophy itself. Now, we thought a lot about machines yesterday, but certainly, as Peter was pointing out, the machine analogy goes way back in history. And from our perspective, it might seem a bit surprising that machine analogies to describe the properties of the world would be introduced within the context of Christian theology. But remember that the machine, for these natural philosophers, it was always God's machine. They saw no tension between mechanism and meaning. For example, Kepler again wrote, "My aim is to show that the heavenly machine is not a kind of divine live being, but a kind of clockwork." Okay, so the Greeks had sort of invested all living things with all kinds of internal necessities, empathies and sympathies, all kinds of things like that. And the natural philosophers were actually saying, well, no, it's just a machine. Not just a machine, but it is a machine, and it's God's machine. And there were three natural philosophers in particular who were responsible for promoting this mechanical philosophy. There was the French Catholic René Descartes, whom Peter was mentioning yesterday, French Catholic priest Pierre Cassendi, and there was also this English Anglican Robert Boyle, as we just mentioned. Now, their approaches were very distinctive, but they were all united in their enthusiasm for mechanistic analogies in explaining the properties of matter. And they all thought that these analogies were valuable theologically in helping people to understand God's creative actions. And this machine analogy, as I said, had this great advantage for their purposes, that it helped to dispel the idea that matter was kind of imbued with all these sympathies and empathies that seemed to make it almost alive and independent from the actions of a creator God. Now, Gassendi was a committed experimentalist himself. He's of particular interest because he revived the ancient atomism of the Greek Epicurus. Epicurus was a polytheist, but Gassendi simply took his philosophy, baptized it into a Christian theology, as it were, and God, said Gassendi, had created a finite number of indivisible atoms, and he'd infused them with just the right amount of motion to fulfill his providential intentions, his plans for the created order. Now, Robert Boyle, at the same time, thought that there were even smaller units, which he called corpuscles, and he saw no reason why these could not be further subdivided. And of course, it's Boyle's corpuscles which form the basis for his famous Boyle's laws of gases, which probably some of us had to learn at some stage in our school career. And so Boyle's clockwork universe was constructed by a wise God in such a way that it needed no constant adjustment. And there's a very interesting quote here, I think, which perhaps has some relevance to some of the discussions about intelligent design that we've been having. And some of these discussions we're having today were thought about a lot by the natural philosophers of the 17th century. And I like to read this complete quote because I think it's quite interesting. This is by Boyle. "It more sets off the wisdom of God in the fabric of the universe that he can make so vast a machine perform all those many things which he designed it should, by the mere contrivance of brute matter managed by certain laws of local motion and upheld by his ordinary and general concourse, than if from time to time he employed an intelligent overseer, such as nature is fancied to be, to regulate, assist, and control the motions of the parts." Now, I know if English is not your first language, that's a pretty, 17th century English is different. But essentially what Boyle is saying here is that God has made a machine, God directly interacts with that machine, he endows all of the matter of that machine with properties that are quite sufficient to do everything that he wants, and you don't need any intervening operation of anything else. And he's rather criticizing the idea that there's something else called nature which does things. And Boyle was very, very critical of that kind of idea. Okay, so the final couple of theological points I'd like to just to flag up, both arise in fact out of the what happened during the Reformation and so forth. I know that Peter is going to be talking a lot more about this on Monday, but remember that at the end of the Reformation, Europe ended up pretty much 50-50 Protestant and Catholic. Now that did have some pretty enormous implications for the whole idea of authority. European societies became more pluralistic, and just as the reformers encouraged people to read the book of God's Word, the scriptures, for themselves and make up their own minds, so the natural philosophers proclaimed that everyone had to read the book of nature for themselves and find out what it actually said and not what the ancient authorities had told them that it said. And so it's been suggested, in particular by Peter, who's going to, I'm sure, talk about this in Unit 2 next week, how the more literal understanding, in fact, of the biblical text encouraged during the Reformation had perhaps the unintended consequence of stimulating a less allegorical and more literal reading of the book of nature. And therefore, that sort of promoted a more empirical attitude towards the world. If you like, you can say that nature was demythologized in one sense, that when you make it a machine, then you start looking at it just as it is, as objects to be studied and investigated, and so forth. Now, given the rapid development of the new experimental philosophy during the 16th and 17th centuries, I think it's perhaps surprising how little conflict there was between the natural philosophers and the political and ecclesiastical authorities of the time. It was an era when you could certainly be burnt at the stake for theological heresy, although fortunately that was pretty rare, yet no natural philosopher of this era was ever killed for their ideas, nor even imprisoned. The nearest we get to heavy-handed suppression of ideas is the house arrest that Galileo suffered at the hands of the Inquisition, and then later on, during the 19th century, the Galileo affair began to be presented as a kind of icon of the conflict thesis. Now, David Limburg is going to be giving a whole talk about this on Monday, and we just don't have time, I'm afraid, to review the whole Galileo affair at all at this moment. I've just put up a slide there which summarizes a few points. But I just want to highlight the fact that through that whole rather unfortunate affair, Galileo himself remained, of course, a loyal Catholic to the end of his days. And what I would suggest here as a sort of take-home message is what we have in this particular conflict, if you like, is not a clash between science and faith, but it was partly a clash between two very different cosmologies, two different ways also of interpreting the Bible, and perhaps most importantly of all, a clash between two different personalities whom we have up here, because Galileo was not at all diplomatic in some of the things that he did. He sort of lacked diplomatic skills, very like, I have to say, some scientists of today. Now, given this sort of theological womb, I like to call it, from which modern science emerged, we may then want to ask the question, why is it that the conflict thesis got going? How did that happen? And I just want to spend my last minutes on considering that particular question. Now, this is especially puzzling when you have to remember that natural theology remained very, very popular, at least in this country, until well into the 19th century. It was immensely popular. And when we say natural theology, we mean the idea that the study of God's creation demonstrates his power and his handiwork. Now, the Boyle lectures had been established by Robert Boyle himself in the late 17th century, and then later on also in 1829, the Earl of Bridgewater put aside £8,000 in his will. That's about $650,000, by the way, in today's money, so it was not a trivial amount, to fund a series of volumes of natural theology, and these were eventually produced by the top British natural philosophers of the day. So there was a complete sort of fusion still between the scientific enterprise in England and Britain at least, and natural theology that continued right up to the middle part of the 19th century. So what changed? Now, there are a number of books on the bookstall that go into this in much more detail. I'm just going to give you the very brief overview. In fact, in my own book, Rebuilding the Matrix, you can find there also a summary of some of these points. But certainly, as far as the roots of the conflict thesis in France are concerned, we can trace those back clearly to the 18th century philosophes, as they called themselves. They were people who were tired of the financial and intellectual control which the Catholic Church exerted over French society. And the philosophes were a very heterogeneous collection of French writers and philosophers who kind of popularized the findings of the natural philosophers to the French public. Now, with very few exceptions, remember the philosophes were not the natural philosophers themselves. They were people of arts and letters and so forth. And a typical example is provided by Bernard de Fontenelle, who became secretary of the French Academy of Sciences, and in this post he transmitted natural philosophy to the French bourgeoisie with great success. Fontenelle was a skeptic, and in contrast to the pulpits where you so often have preached the Newtonian worldview in England, his reports of scientific discoveries were frequently presented in a very anti-clerical kind of mould. And so you have, if you like, the findings of the natural philosophers being conveyed to the general public through the secularizing window. That was the outlet, if you like, and that had a great influence on the tone, and even the understanding of secularism today in France is different from that in other countries for that very reason. Now that tone of the philosophe, as I say, was very, very different from the natural theologians, though who are still very popular, found across here in Britain. And probably natural theology reached its peak of influence during the first half of the 19th century. Here in Cambridge, every undergraduate continued to be examined on the classical works of natural theology, such as William Paley's great book, Natural Theology, a book which Charles Darwin was later to claim had been one of the few works which had stimulated him intellectually during his time here. He had to be examined on those works. And it was during the latter part of the 19th century, with the growing professionalization of science, that most historians see the roots of the conflict model as far as this country is concerned. Now here's a contrast. In 1800, science in Britain was largely an activity that was run by amateurs. Financial support for science was mainly that of private patronage. There were few opportunities for scientific employment. Most scientific research was carried out by gentlemen of leisure with private funding. They were typically clerics who had their own lands, and the Royal Society provided a fashionable forum in which such gentlemen could meet in a convivial atmosphere to present their findings. I'm sure Bob will tell us it's the same today, of course, as well. But specialization was rare. And so sort of dabbling, just doing a little bit of scientific interest on the side, that was still pretty common. And patronage and employment in the sciences was much easier to find if you were ordained in the Church of England, if you were in the clergy, or if you perhaps were a layman, not ordained, but you were known for your religious commitments. The universities and secondary schools were dominated by clerics, and the teaching of science was marginalized by this huge emphasis placed on the humanities, especially on the classics. But if you go to 1900, just 1 century later, all that has changed. A huge revolution took place. And the scientific enterprise by then was not so different, really, from the one that we know and love today. Scientists had a name by that time that everyone agreed upon. They had a new status as a group of professionals. Numerically, they were far greater than in 1800, and public spending on science had increased dramatically. And science by then had become much more specialized, and this was reflected in a huge increase in the number of specialist societies and journals. At the same time, clerics were much less represented in the scientific world, and their own calling had become increasingly professionalized during the century in response to the needs of rapidly expanding urbanized populations. And so scientists at that time were much less likely to be motivated by natural theology in order to pursue their professions. They were much more likely to practice their religious beliefs as an activity that was sort of separate from their professional lives as scientists. And scientific education was now a major emphasis in both the universities and the secondary schools. And it's been convincingly argued that the social changes required for such a dramatic transition of the scientific enterprise from its 1800 form to its 1900 form is really at the heart of the so-called Victorian conflict thesis. And then from the 1850s onwards, a new group of scientists emerged, and they were scientists by now, who began to campaign for greater professional rights and status of scientists. And they were mostly fellows of the Royal Society, and they formed, in fact, they formed a collection, or a club, which they called the X Club, and campaigned for their political goals using the Royal Society as a venue for their political campaign. And these X-Club members were scientists who had grown up really on the peripheries of the Victorian establishment, well outside the privileged circle who had easy access to financial support for their science. And Thomas Henry Huxley, who's shown here, was a member of the X-Club, and he was particularly pugnacious in his attempts to try and get the financial and intellectual prestige enjoyed by the church into the hands of the newly emerging scientific community. No longer could they allow science to be controlled, as in the past, by these amateurish clerics, but it had to be controlled by the scientists themselves. And Huxley loved rhetoric, and again, you know, this is in old 19th century English, but you have to put it up because it's such a wonderful quote. This is the sort of thing that Huxley said: "Extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes beside that of Hercules. And history records that wherever science and orthodoxy have been fairly opposed, the latter have been forced to retire from the lists, bleeding and crushed, if not annihilated, scotched, if not slain." Now, if English is not your first language, I'm just sorry. But you know what it means is this is rhetoric. This is 19th century rhetoric against the church and all that it stood for. And so Huxley was really a kind of Richard Dawkins of the late 19th century, I think we'd have to say. So the idea here then is that the conflict thesis was born not out of a clash between science and religion, but out of an ideological campaign to establish scientists as the leading intellectual voice in society with established prestige as an independent professional community. And the growth of the conflict model was greatly helped by a series of books that popularized warfare imagery in order to describe the relationship between science and religion. And these titles speak for themselves: History of the Warfare Between Science and Theology, and so on. And these were enormously popular books, and they had a great influence in the thinking of the general public. Now, they're very much Whiggish views, Whiggish histories of the relationship between science and religion. Tales of the triumph of science in winning over the ignorant people of medieval times who thought that the world was flat and ignorant and so on. And as I say, no modern historian of science would accept these particular kinds of books seriously as an adequate description of the historical relationship between science and faith. But they did much to spread the idea of the warfare imagery between science and religion. And just let me say in closing that you may have noticed that I've excluded from this account of the emergence of the conflict model in this country any mention of Darwin at all. Now, clearly in the United States at least, it's the conflict between creationists and evolutionists, if you like, that's helping to keep this whole conflict model alive. And it's not just in the States, but of course quite a number of other countries as well. But I think historically there's really very little evidence for the idea that the conflict model stems from Darwin, except insofar as evolution was used as an ideological tool by people like Huxley in his campaign on behalf of the scientific profession. Now, the theological responses to Darwin were very varied. It's very difficult to make simple generalizations. But overall, Darwinian evolution was kind of baptized into a Christian worldview within a few decades of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. And actually, you have to remember that the publication of The Origin of Species in North America was organized by the committed Christian professor of natural history at Harvard, Arthur Gray. And in the 19th century, evolution in North America was popularized to a very large degree by people who were both scientists and committed Christians. And indeed, with hindsight, many Christians were grateful to Darwin for disinfecting Christian faith of what they thought to have become an overemphasis on natural theology as promoted by people like William Paley. So we'll finish where we began with our 4 different models relating science and religion, but now I've begun to try and put a few names from the history of science religion onto these different models. And the only thing I want to emphasize as I close, that when you actually look at these different models, it's very easy to find different names that you can attach to all of the models except one. At least if you go up to the late 19th century, it's very hard to find obvious names that you can put into the NOMA model. It's simply, when you look back at the history of the relationship between science and religion, there has always been this traffic both ways, and I'm glad to say it's still continuing to the present day. And so I'll close there. Thank you.
Denis, thank you very much. We have time for questions as usual. We'll stop at 10:30 so that we can have refreshments. Let me just make one comment from the chair that you mentioned the Royal Society towards the end. The motto of the Royal Society is nullus in verba, which broadly speaking means take nobody's word for it. Go and find out for yourself. Founded in the 1660s, that was very much the model that Denis was talking about. It was founded because scientists wanted to find out for themselves what was going on, not just read the ancient texts. Well, that's given you time to think of questions. Some at the front here. Let's start at the front and move backwards.
I'm very impressed to see what can be done to put the history of science into an hour. One question I do have, though, regarding your treatment of Darwin. I shouldn't necessarily say Darwinism. Darwin had the effect of convincing people not of Darwinism, but of evolution or transformism in his day, and that seems to have had the effect of finally snapping concordism in the way that geology didn't. I mean, people like Sedgwick and Gould and so on seem to be able to hold on to what they took to be a fairly robust view of biblical authority, even with long geological timescales. But it seems like that really starts to snap once transformism is widely accepted. So I wonder if that's maybe a point that could use a little bit more emphasis.
Right. In case you didn't hear at the back, the point being made is that in the reception of Darwinism, which I did skate over very, very quickly, and there's a huge, as we all know, there's a huge literature about that. But the point being made is that that during the reception of Darwinism, the understanding of the interpretation of the scriptures, which are called concordis, so there were people who wanted to bring the scriptural text to the Bible and make it concord in some way or other with the account being given by this new theory that Darwin had brought in, and that was handled quite well. I think was the point you were being made by certain figures.
With geology, they thought
yes.
successful with biology that no longer seemed credible.
Yes. So I think you find quite a variety actually in the ways of handling the biblical text. But what you don't find is very much literalism actually in the 19th century in terms of treating the biblical text as treating scientific truths. And you actually find a very, it depends on who you're reading, you know, but if you go to somebody like Aubrey Moore, for example, who wrote a lot about the Darwinism in the late 19th century, he was actually an Anglo-Catholic at the high wing of the Anglican Church. And so he was very happy to absorb Darwinism fully into a Christian theology, and he was very grateful. In fact, he was the one who specifically said we should be grateful to Darwin for disinfecting Christian theology with this over-emphasis on natural theology. You know, it became very, very strong during the early part of the 19th century, and he thought that that therefore downgraded the idea of God's creative action and so forth, that it was an unhelpful emphasis. So there were different theologians who handled the reception in different kinds of ways, actually. But what you don't really find is biblical literalism, and you really have to come up to about the First World War, actually, in that time, and so forth, before you get much more of a growth of the idea that the biblical text should be interpreted as a scientific text. You don't find that so much certainly in the academic world of the 19th century. They were already interpreting it in various ways, but certainly not as a sort of scientific textbook. That's why you have people like Adam Sidgwick here as the first professor of geology, who was a very much committed Christian, who was a cleric, again having a concordist view in the understanding of Genesis chapter 1. He would have viewed it simply as a theological text which wasn't there to tell us about the age of the earth or something like that. So
I think that might be a bit strong. The gap theory and the age theory did a lot of work for people, for those sorts of people like Sedgwick. And so
Yes.
for a long time, and that's what ceases to be credible.
Yes. Yeah, there were various ways of handling Genesis chapter 1, you know, which people utilized really to make space, if you like, for cooperating what became to be known as evolution into their worldview. By the way, just a little point here, it's worth remembering that in the first edition of The Origin of Species, the word evolution is not mentioned once. I don't know if you know that, but the word evolution had more the sense of embryological development at the time when Darwin was writing his book. So he used the term descent with modification. If you go into the later editions of The Origin, you do find a few mentions of the word evolution. It gradually came in, but it wasn't there in the first edition. But if you count the number of times the word create, created, or creating are used by Darwin in the first edition of The Origin, the answer is 104. It's quite interesting, isn't it? He was writing in an era which was completely saturated with natural theology, and so it was very normal to talk about creating, and so forth. And you find that all over the first edition. And then later on, actually, there's a classic paragraph at the end where he talks about God breathing the original forms into, the forms that later on evolved and so forth. So there's lots of natural theology actually there in the various editions of The Origin of Species.
I think that's all we've got enough time.
Thank you for your very interesting and thoughtful presentation. Dennis, can I make a friendly criticism?
Oh, please, Subrata. Yeah, because
Well,
you're so good at them. You make them so nicely. So,
Well, my friends and colleagues in South Asia, they consider sometimes that the whole debate and discussions on science and religion in the West is very partial, in the sense that many of the things are not discussed or not touched up at all. I mean, when you say that it is science and religion, it appears it's Western science and religion. For example, there is no mentioning whatsoever about the role of science which the Chinese civilization or the Hindu civilization had followed. And the mathematics, for example, I'm not going into the history, astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, alchemy, medical science, whatsoever. I mean, these are all pushed into the periphery. And another question is that, so is it fair to include, not to include other aspects or other scientific worldviews into this whole issue. And secondly, science and religion occur in the socio-political setting and which is very much dominated and influenced by politics. By modern science developed at least intertwined with capitalism, and capitalism has got the relationship with imperialism. So your biographical approach is fine, and I don't have any problem. I do agree with it. But will it not be partial if we do not say about the role of racism, capitalism, with the socialism being into the picture, and not to talk about the negative aspects of this development, in the sense that how one particular worldview, subjugated or did disservice to the other worldviews, and it's kind of quite complex in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, so the point's being perfectly validly made that in a 1-hour talk one misses out an awful lot. So I was hoping my health warning at the beginning would sort of guard against this obvious point that there's a huge amount of, you need to do a 3-year university course, obviously, in this subject to really have a nuanced and balanced view. So just to come back to the first point that Subrata was mentioning, there's a huge multi-volume work by Joseph Needham about the history of science in China, which is fascinating. And one of the one of the issues that he raises, obviously, is given the huge amount of technological advance and the early Chinese science, why didn't it go further? It's a very interesting question. Now, actually, what Needham said was he thought it was because there wasn't this concept of a creator God who brings things into being, and therefore, if you don't have that, you don't have the driving force, if you like, to look for laws and to try and find the laws. Now, that was his view, rightly or wrongly. I'm not an expert in that area. But there's a huge literature on that, which is fascinating. And there's a huge literature, obviously, on Islamic science, on the whole role of Islamic science in producing the algebra, the maths that we have today, and so forth. So I'm very, very aware of that, and there simply wasn't time to bring that in. But I think on your second point, it's also very, very important that, as I said, there are economic, there are social, there are political things going on here. And what we're doing here is sort of taking a slice of a very complex cake and focusing on that. And we shouldn't forget that there's a huge, big, complex cake out there. And I think in a way, I sort of look in it as an analogy. I work on biochemical signaling pathways inside a cell. Okay, so as I think you're familiar with, so A goes to B, goes to C. You need a whole collection of things together. Let's not call it irreducibly complex, but you need a lot of things together in order for the whole system to work. So, and I think it's a case where in the emergence of modern science, there were lots and lots of components that had to come together at the same time, to actually function properly. And you could have removed any one of them, and you wouldn't have had the same history. History is complex like that. There are lots of components in there, and one is dependent on the other, and another is dependent on the other one, and so forth. So I think that's also very, very important to point out. But I think the whole point of Western science, it would be very interesting if Peter had a comment on this, because, in fact, Peter, would you like to comment on that question? It would be fascinating. Why not pass the mic to Peter? And I've been keeping him in reserve, you see, for these really difficult questions. Yeah. Sorry. Peter Harrison, Professor of History from Bond University in Australia. So.
Look, it's a tough question, but I think you can partly rule it out simply by defining science in a particular way, defining it as Western science. If we ask about the kinds of contemporary scientific practices, whether it's in Australia or Britain or Europe or India, it's essentially it's essentially Western science. To that extent, I think the question we're asking is what are the historical origins of this particular phenomenon, and so. This is not to say that there aren't comparative practices in other cultures that are similar, but we're focusing on a somewhat different question. The issue of whether this Western development has been entirely positive in all of its components, I think, is a very interesting question. Again, not one that Denis has chosen to address, and quite properly, but it's certainly one that I think is profitable, and it relates, I think, to the Whiggish triumphalist understanding of science, insofar as the assumption is that in the progress of science everything has been positive and fantastic, and that's a whole other question, I think. It's certainly one worth asking. It's probably not the question that Denis was going to address. Look, as a historian, I think that was a terrific summary, I must say. They're the sorts of points that I think are really, that you gave in your address that are the key ones.
Let's have another question. I know this one there.
Hello, Denis, thank you. That was a wonderful overview for me, certainly. What I'm interested in, being an engineer, of course, is what are the practical implications for us today, because history is an interesting thing to study and fascinating story. But you then say, can we learn some lessons? And obviously, our concern, or certainly my concern, I'm sure yours, would be the conflict model and how it appears to be being emphasized and, well, I would have to argue, damaging to both science and to religion. So motivation, therefore, motivation of the conflict model, I was very interested in, illuminated really by what you said on the conflict reasonings for it, the motivation for it in the last century, well, not the last century, the one before the last century. So motivations today, and you think, well, there are different motivations today, and if we understood those motivations, not just as personalities, but as deep down, why, it can't be the same concern as before, because science is acknowledged, science is, you know, supreme in a sense. So that can't be it. So it must be to do with this growth of literalism and concern of the consequence of religion. So I'd like to ask you, it's not quite history, it's where we are today in the conflict model. Forgetting the personality thing, why do we think that the conflict model seems to have some ascendancy? What are the core reasons for that? What can we do about it? Because, I mean, this institute, in a sense, is something to do, but on a wider community basis. So what are the reasons for the common, what are the motivations and the reasons, and how can we address this in a positive way?
Okay, so if you didn't get the whole question over there, I mean, essentially it is interesting history on the origins of the conflict model, but how do we handle it today? It's still going on, it's still being fueled. What are the factors that are fueling the continuing popularity of the conflict model in the public domain, in some countries perhaps more than others? But I'd need a very long answer to do justice to that. I'll give you the brief view I would want to take. I think there are a number of factors here which are fueling it. Obviously one is that when you get two poles that are very opposite to each other, they tend to live off each other, and I think almost need each other for their own existence. So at the moment, if you look at those atheistic scientists who want to utilize the resources of science, and particularly evolution, to support their atheism in a kind of ideological way, you know, they're the sort of mirror image, if you like, of the so-called scientific creationists at the other end of the pole, who obviously want to go to the biblical text and construct a theory from the biblical text which is completely counter to all of modern science. Now, it seems to me those sort of two opposite poles actually feed off each other, and if neither one wasn't there, the other would tend to go down. But you know, if you carry on, for example, if you keep telling the public, the general public, you know, that evolution equals atheism, then of course the religious public will say, oh, well, we don't want evolution, you know, because that's obviously dangerous. You know, it's going to undermine morality and do all these terrible things to us. So it becomes ideologically invested with all kinds of things, you know. And so I think those poles, especially, of course, in the States, when they play out in court cases and whether you should teach, evolution in schools and all that kind of issue and so forth, that all helps to fuel in the public domain this kind of conflict thesis. And I think it's always a question, in fact, which we can learn from the history of science, that once you start investing scientific theories with ideological significance, then they come out into the public domain, and they cease to be just scientific theories. They become much more than that. And I suppose Darwinism has suffered a lot from that. I mean, Darwinism over the century and a half since 1859, I mean, it's been used to support socialism, capitalism, racism. I mean, almost every ideology you can imagine, Darwinism has been used to support that. Now, clearly, that can't all be right, because many of those ideologies are actually opposite to each other. So it's this investment, I think, with people trying to use ideology, trying to invest scientific theories with ideology, which I think does a lot to fuel then the social conflict out there in the public domain. So that's sort of one angle on that. And I think one of the sort of, one thing that I would like to do is simply say, well, science is just science. It does a job. Let's get on with that job. Let's keep other things out of the science lecture theatre and the classroom and just stick with the science, Not because I think it's in a watertight compartment, but because I think we need to avoid this tendency to invest ideology into our scientific theories. Now, the other thing I was going to mention is that the media love conflict. And that is a factor we have to face up to. And, I interact a fair bit with people in radio and TV. And I've had people, like I was on a panel last year where we had a little break, the commercial break where the producer comes in and has a little chat with the people who are discussing on air, And he said, argue more, argue more. We were being too, we were all academics having this urbane, balanced, calm discussion, and obviously he didn't like that, He wanted us to really go for it, And that's what they like, unfortunately. I think it makes for very bad television, very bad radio, but that's what the media, some segment of the media still like, and I think that all, and it sells newspapers, obviously, if you put in conflicting articles and so forth, so. Sorry, bit of a long answer. It's a complex question.
Thanks. I find this stuff fascinating. Continuing on the conflict thing. I've got it. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's obviously not escaped my notice that there's a certain degree of hostility here towards Dawkins, which is understandable because Dawkins exhibits hostility. You said at the start that you don't have people like Dawkins and Atkins in Cambridge. I'm interested.
I was being slightly facetious, but,
but
carry on.
I guess that. I don't know Oxford, Cambridge very well.
Okay.
Is Cambridge traditionally a more theologically minded base and Oxford a more secular seat? I don't know. Would Dawkins be welcome to come and speak at an event like this? Would he come? Would you ask him? Because I'm wondering,
Yes.
if there's that bipolarity, it suggests that we're not mixing the bag enough and we don't make progress through dialogue.
Okay, so first, this is a question about Richard Dawkins and so forth. Let me put it on record, and this is on film, that I think Richard Dawkins' books are great. And I think the recent book, actually, The Ancestor's Tale, in particular, is a very good popular account of evolutionary theory. I would lend it to anybody or recommend it for that purpose. Now, of course, the problem there is, in his earlier writings in particular, he keeps putting in the sort of anti-religious rhetoric. It actually has nothing to do with the science that he's writing about. It gets popped in every now and again. The great thing about The Ancestor's Tale, he doesn't do that. He manages to resist that temptation. So there's only about two, I think I counted them, two anti-religious sort of swipes in the whole book. A record. The next book will go the other way to make up for it. Never mind. But this was just a book about evolutionary biology. So there's absolutely nothing personal against Dawkins or anybody else for that matter. And indeed, in the journalist course we had here last summer, Richard Dawkins came over and spoke in a journalist course here. And there was open discussion and so forth. In fact, he came the same day as Simon Conway Morris, so that was a good day to come. And so there was, they had a good discussion together. So, there is open discussion and debate, and I think that's very, very important. And if Richard Dawkins would like to come and, speak on one of these courses, I think it would be wonderful. He'd be very welcome to come. So I think that would be an excellent idea. So I think the idea of an open society where you have open discussion and open debate is extremely important. And I think it's very, very important. And I hope that I have never given this impression of you kind of sort of demonize the enemy as if, some person or some representation of something is all bad. It's never the case. Life is always much more complex than that. And as I say, I value his scientific writings highly. Now, as far as just Cambridge is concerned, obviously it's a huge mixture of everybody. And I don't want to generalize really in seriousness there. No possibility of generalization. Having said that, there is a strong Puritan history. If you go back in the history of Cambridge, the history of the Puritans, who were very influential also in the origins of modern science, as Peter Harrison behind you will certainly support, the Puritans were particularly strong here in Cambridge stronger than in Oxford. And I think generally the natural sciences have been promoted more here in Cambridge compared to Oxford. I think that generalization would be true historically.